You're watching The Fix with me, Karima Brown. 2020 has indeed been a game changer with the outbreak of a global public health crisis, which has impacted South Africa badly on a host of levels. To take a look at the political and economic fallout for us, I'm joined in the studio by Professor Adam Habib from Wits University and, of course, also economist Duma Kubule. Gentlemen, thank you so much for coming into the studio. 2020, I'm going to leave out the adjectives. We all have our own experiences. But let's start with the question of the ANC's, difficulty in constructing after so many years of degradation in terms of political morality. Is this something they can do now? And is this something that, in a way, history has almost forced upon them, despite the fact that so many of its leaders, Adam, is looking for a way out?
So I think, firstly, history has forced it upon them. So that's the first thing. And I think that they're struggling to manage this. On the one hand, the real big question is that there is an NPA that has charged the Secretary General 21 charges. And what you hear too many people in the ANC saying is we're going to rely on his revolutionary consciousness, on his integrity. So you're going to rely on the integrity of somebody who's got 21 charges against them. If they've got 21 charges against them, there's a good chance they don't have much of an integrity or much of a revolutionary morality. So it seems to me the ANC has to make itself very clear on this. And some of them have said to me that they have. Here's what they should be doing. They should be saying, we want you to step aside, not step down, step aside. But if you don't, we suspend you. That's the choice. And it seems to me some have said that, but too many aren't. Too many are playing around with kind of rhetorical gestures of revolutionary morality. I think it needs to be very clear. Step aside or you get suspended. And I think that shouldn't apply simply to the Secretary General. It should cascade throughout the organization, in the provincial structures, in the municipalities, across the board. And I think if it doesn't do that, it hasn't behaved in the manner that is required by this historical moment.
Duma, I saw you shaking your head. Were you nodding in agreement, or do you have a different view?
No, I was nodding in agreement, yes. I mean, we can't be debating step aside for the whole year or next 2 years. There has to be some agreement on what should happen here.
Absolutely. Now, I mean, the country is fascinated, Duma, by this political process playing itself out. And yet the economic crisis is, in fact, the overarching, overwhelming, fundamental crisis that the South African society faces. We have unparalleled inequality in our country, joblessness. And if the surge is anything to go by, we are going to have quite a few sick people on a very patchy public health and even private healthcare system that's already grinding, under the pressure. When you look back at 2020 and the fact that we have been, hit with a crisis that we haven't seen since the outbreak of the Spanish flu, did our economic leaders, both in government and in business and in the trade unions, rise to the occasion to deal with the depth of that crisis? Could they fashion an imaginative enough, strategy to try and shield the majority of South Africans from the devastation of the pandemic?
Thank you. Karima, I actually looked at, this is a crisis like no other. And if you look at the statistics, the last year we had a GDP collapse of this was in about 1930. But what's going to happen now will be more than what happened in 1930. I looked back at the data and they talk about 1921, the last time this happened. So I do believe that I've been following the discussions at NEDLAC. It was an incredible year. We had 2 speeches by the president in April. The stimulus announcement, in October, the recovery plan. Then we had 3 budgets within the course of a year. And you must remember as well, in March at the beginning of the year, world equity and stock markets collapsed. The oil price collapsed as well. It was a crazy year, and $100 billion fled emerging markets towards the US. And in South Africa itself, our currency seized. We had a junk rating the day before, I think a couple of days before the lockdown. So it was an incredible year, once in a lifetime. We will not see something like this in our lifetimes, hopefully again. And I just think that if you look at the leadership, the response to it was a fraction of what was required. There was talk of a 500 billion rand stimulus package, but if you look at that stimulus package and you go through it forensically, a fraction of the 500 billion was actually spent. For example, the loan guarantee scheme was supposedly 200 billion rands, but the money that was actually advanced was about 17 billion by the banks, and 75% of it went to white businesses. So what the banks were doing was shifting, using a state guarantee to shift loans towards their prime clients. And then if you look at the Treasury response, the Treasury response was an increase in government spending of 36 billion rands after excluding interest. Now, that is 0.7% of GDP compared with a 8 to 10% expected decline. That was the government response. Then we had the response from Unemployment Insurance Fund of 50 billion rands. Now, if you add all of that together, it was about 80 to 100 billion rands, and it was far less than the collapse of the economy. So if you look at the global stimulus packages, they were saying go big, go big, go household, and all of that. Yeah. But we didn't do any of that. We didn't go fast. We didn't go household. And let's just talk about those grants. There were 50 billion rands in grants, but that was only 10% of the headline number of the stimulus. But if you look at countries like most countries, households got about 50% of the stimulus packages. Yeah.
Now, Adam, I mean, whether you agree with Duma on whether the package was, the correct response in terms of numbers and the scale with which it tilted toward, an expansionary approach rather than an austerity approach, the truth of the matter is no matter what was allocated, you needed a capable state to implement it, right? And in South Africa, you've had the Minister of Employment and Labour sacking the entire management of the UIF. I had the Minister of Social Development on this program twice, and still we don't have the system being able to actually give you accurate data on who needs to get that 350 Rand COVID stress relief grant. We have a situation where someone like Carol Bauer, a businesswoman, is alleged to have received 11 million Rand from the lotto without furnishing us with details of why she received it. To what extent is state failure and the lack of capacity part of the problem in delivering, whether we think it's a half-baked measure or even the proper response to South Africans, both at the level of households as well as, the level of institutions such as small businesses, banks and other players in the economy?
So I think that, you can have the best economic policy in the world. If you don't have the politics right, that economic policy is immaterial. And it seems to me that there's two crises. One is institutions, what you call state capacity, and the second is leadership. I think Duma started speaking about effectively leadership. Was the decision right? Was it big enough? And frankly, I think that leadership problem is at two levels. One is, are we making the right numbers? Did we decide? Were we bold enough? But then secondly, the sectoral leadership. Were the banks using it in the way that they should have? Were the unions behaving in the manner that they should have? And I'm not so sure that was happening. And I think that there's a large element of truth in that, and we need to talk about the failure of leadership. The second is institutions. And frankly, our institutions don't function. We've got a crisis of institutions. We don't have capable people in public institutions. That applies from the public health system to some of the education system to much of the if you like, distribution mechanisms around social support grants, etc. That's a crisis. And that crisis is because we've been appointing, firstly, we've been deploying cadres who are unqualified, but we're also making appointments of people who, on the transformation grounds, don't meet the criteria. And I think we're lying to ourselves that our institutions are dysfunctional. And frankly, we can't deliver. I'll end by this. If you have that crisis, the trick about this is, in South Africa is interesting. You do have capabilities. You do have capabilities in the private sector with logistic companies. You should have called them in and said, we want to distribute, instead of distributing alcohol, you're distributing food parcels. This is how you'll do it. And if you don't, or if you do what the banks did, we're going to penalize you. We're going to dock 10%. That kind of regulatory capacity is missing. And for me, that's the challenge in our public institutions.
Let's take it back to the question of the policy options that we did go for. We saw the rest of the world doing pretty unprecedented things on the kinds of stimulus packages that it has rolled out. Now, the government keeps on insisting, A, that this is new money, that they've put together, despite whether we argue about whether the package is big enough or not. But we also saw the majority of that money, Duma, going for big business, not actually into households. We are still not okay with each other in terms of how we understand poverty. We are finally using the expanded definition of what unemployment is. How do you even respond adequately, Duma, if you don't even have the ability to diagnose collectively from a common point of view what your most important crises are? I mean, we are still in a space where the majority of people that needs to be negotiated with are locked outside of the institutions. I mean, NEDLAC is an institution that brings together supposed social contract or social partners, but half of the unions are locked out because of the way in which those structures have been, fragmented. What is required from a policy level, Duma, to bring people together to say, whilst we disagree on 50 other things, perhaps there are 3 things that we all agree on that needs to happen?
You were talking earlier. I've been talking throughout this crisis, especially at the beginning with the Unemployment Insurance Fund, because there was this debate that maybe they're going to run out of funding, and I came to the conclusion that their actuarial calculations were wrong. And I tried to engage with them, and there was no answers coming. So I was not surprised with what happened at the UIF. Now, in terms of NEDLAC, throughout this crisis, I've been talking to everybody at NEDLAC. What amazes me, Katrina, is that Karima, is that they've been talking for months, but we don't see the output. If you read the agreement, the NEDLAC Social Compact, it says nothing about addressing the crisis that we have as a country. They were locked in Zoom meetings for months, and I was trying to understand. So we've got failures in terms of NEDLAC, and I would say the real problem in NEDLAC is that they don't discuss economic policy. The finance minister had a tantrum at NEDLAC that everybody told me about, and he said that NEDLAC is not the place to discuss economic policy. So unless we review this whole NEDLAC arrangement, we will not have a genuine social compact. And the last thing you said is that we need to include everybody under the tent to discuss economic policy. So there's no AMCU, there's no SAFTU, and there's many other people who are not at the table to discuss this thing. So people have been talking for many years that we need this proper economic CODESA that will discuss the compromises that were made 26 years ago and all the mistakes that we made, including the ones of institutional failure that Adam was talking about here.
All right, hold that thought. When we come back, we're going to continue looking back at 2020 and perhaps also chart the way forward for 2021. Stay with us.